Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Danowski with the Oregon Wine Board. You've joined our discussion on smoke impacts in Oregon. And we've got a roster of panelists and speakers who have done some serious preparation to offer you their insights and perspectives during this remarkable time that I don't think our state or our industry has ever been through. This is scheduled to be a 90-minute webinar, online session. Guest speakers will be answering several of the questions, if not all, that have been offered in advance at our invitation during the registration process. If time permits, they'll be able to take some additional questions. So please don't be shy about using the chat feature, but we do have at least 15 to 20 questions that have come in advance, and we want to make sure that we get to those. I should say just a couple things real quick before we get into the logistical and procedural announcements that'll make this session more meaningful for everybody. Number one is that we are not oblivious, nor are we naive to the very, very serious PR and messaging implications that this emergency presents not only for your businesses, but for Oregon as a whole and our industry. However, this particular session has been set up primarily to deal with vineyard and cellar production questions and issues that are most pressing on so many business owners right now. If there's time at the end, we're happy to take as many questions as time allows on other topics, but we have a roster of speakers from around the world, and certainly some of our most experienced Oregon experts who have prepared remarks that are more specific to climatology, to production, to issues that we need to deal with, immediately. So please don't think that messaging and PR and other issues are being forgotten. I want to make sure to acknowledge right off the top that this call is co-hosted by our academic partners at Oregon State University and Linfield University. When we sensed about a week ago that this smoke that just will not let go of us was becoming such a serious problem, and we saw so many of the same questions being answered, late last week we gathered people to pull together the session that we're in right now. I'm going to turn it over to two of my Oregon Wine Board colleagues. First, Jess Willey, then Bree Stock. Jess will talk just a little bit. You've heard from her already with all the meeting invitation and communication information. She has some logistical and procedural information to share. She'll give it to Bree, who will tee up our agenda and our guest speakers.
Hi, everybody. Just looking for my unmute button. I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping here. First off, as Tom may have mentioned, the webinar is being recorded. We'll be sharing a recording of the presentation with everybody that's registered. We had more than 425 people register for this webinar, and a recording will be shared out to all of those people within the next day, so probably look for that tomorrow morning. Also, all attendees are in listen-only mode, so if you do, I see people using the Q&A chat function already, and that's a great way to lob in questions. Bree will be moderating that throughout and making sure that questions get addressed if they are not addressed by the speaker's prepared remarks. Before I turn it over to Bree, I just wanted to make everybody aware, you may have seen in our mailing on Monday that came through for registering for this. We've launched a wildfire smoke toolkit on our industry website. Similar to the content of this webinar, the resources contained there are really focused on the impact of smoke on grapes and wine. They're from renowned research universities such as UC Davis, OSU, the Australian Wine Research Institute. And so there's many links in there, as well as some FAQs on how to manage and assess fruit and smoke impacts on fruit. There are also some other links that may be of interest around disaster assistance, some media talking points, and some other fire-related information. And we'll be updating that as new information and more resources come across our desks. If you want to find this, you can go to our industry website. It's industry.oregonwine.org. And right on the home page, just below the main banner, you can see a link to the Wildfire Toolkit. So you can click there, and then that'll bring you straight into it. And now I will turn it over to Ray.
Sorry, also trying to unmute myself. Welcome everyone. Do I have feedback?
Yes, unfortunately,
Okay.
you do have some feedback, yes.
Okay, let's see if this works. Welcome everyone. We have a lot to get through today. We have a large panel from across the industry. Many experts have given their time to develop their presentations and to be here to answer questions for you all today. First up, we are going to have climatologist Dr. Greg Jones from Linfield University. Following on from Greg is the USDA Director of Risk Management Agency for Oregon and Washington, Benjamin Thiel. And leading our discussion on smoke research and enology and best practices will be Professor Elizabeth Tomasino from Oregon State. Following Elizabeth, we will have Dr. Carolyn Merrill from Jackson Family Wines, who will share the best practices and research on the more than 350 microfermentations that Jackson Family has conducted over the past few weeks. And then Joel Gott, Director of Winemaking, Alyssa Jacobson, will share her experience with smoke and her risk management practices with you all. So with that loose-based agenda, we will also leave time
Marie, are you out there?
Bree did mention that she was having some technical difficulties, so maybe we should just get started with Greg Jones.
Yes, Greg, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. I know you're squeezing us in before a class. Please feel free to go right ahead while we sort Bree out.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I will be starting off our discussion today, mostly covering how we got to this place from a meteorological and climatological perspective, and provide some insights into the short to medium to long-term forecast. However, the most important content will come from others on this session, so I will keep my comments brief. If we go back to the recent past, in late August, there were many indications for an early September heat event and continued dry conditions in the West, while the Central Plains was forecast to see below normal temperatures. This is all setting up this issue that we had in terms of this weather event. Around the 3rd of September, forecasts started indicating a major cold air mass and wind flow event coming out of Canada. This was the direct result of the anomalous large high pressure area that we had over the West that extended from the Four Corners region to the Gulf of Alaska. And also this large high pressure dome pushed the jet stream northward over and down the east side of the high pressure dome, helping to create or push the outflow from Canada. By September 5th, forecast surety increased tremendously for this wind event. From a meteorological and climatological perspective, this event was extremely rare, with fewer than 2 or 3 noted events with similar magnitudes in our instrumental data record. Most of these were in the early 1900s. The Tillamook fire and the Bandon fire are two good examples. But this one that just occurred appears to have been stronger, from stronger winds. It also created a much drier condition than previous events, and it came on top of an already extremely dry landscape that we had in place. However, I should note here that even though these are low frequency events, they are part of our climatic framework for areas west of the Cascades and west of the Sierra Nevada mountains, so they should be expected from time to time. As fires raged, and we all saw, the initial offshore winds sent smoke over the region at medium to relatively high altitudes. This smoke carried out over 1,000 miles into the Pacific. However, the winds calmed, and as high pressure built back in from the southeast, these winds calmed even more. Smoke and particulate matter fell towards the surface, lowering air quality tremendously across the region. But low-level smoke produced other effects, namely the reduction in incoming solar radiation and surface heating. By all measures and models that I can look at, daytime temperatures have been lowered 10 to 15 degrees, and at least over a couple of days from those daytime temperatures being lowered, nighttime temperatures also dropped 5 to 15 degrees. Therefore, we lost significant heat accumulation or ripening potential from what appeared to be a stable, warm period over at least the first 2 weeks, if not more, of September. Current conditions, and then looking into the future a little bit, the cutoff low off of California and Oregon that appeared to be bringing some relief over the last couple of days basically just spun offshore and fizzled as a wind and rainmaker for us. It did entrain mid to high level smoke from out over the Pacific, and now that smoke has been transported all the way to New England and is even being shown on satellite images in the North Atlantic. But in Oregon, the winds largely moved over the top of the inversion that we've had, which was largely created by the smoke itself. This inversion is producing fog, holding smoke in the valleys, and it will be very slow to scour out as the flow in the atmosphere doesn't really look very conducive for large-scale surface to mid-level moderate wind speeds that we really need. There is a decent chance for up to about a quarter inch of rain falling on Thursday through Friday, with definitely the higher terrain likely receiving the most. This will definitely help, but we need more. I can see clear skies by Monday into Wednesday, but some level of smoke will likely remain and wax and wane as wind flow patterns change day to day. The proximity of the big fires means that smoldering landscapes will likely continue until we get some sustained rains in the fall and even into the winter. Continued smoke may keep temperatures also from reaching their full potential or their full forecasted potential. And this will likely continue for the foreseeable future, meaning what little ripening benefit we had still in the month of September might be minimized depending on smoke levels and density over the next week or two. The forecast for the remaining month is actually pretty good in the absence of smoke. It's pointing to seasonal to slightly warmer than average temperatures with near average rainfall for late September in our region. What I can see right now is I would expect 2 to 3, possibly 4 minor rain events spread out over the next 2 weeks. And right now, none of them look to be very substantial, but we do have them coming. The forecast over the next 90 days or so, especially over the shorter period of that, is really kind of mixed. Many forecasts are pointing to a warm and relatively dry fall into the first half of winter. However, both the North and tropical Pacific are hinting at La Nina and cold transitions that might likely move us into a colder and wetter midwinter. But for all intents and purposes, most everything I'm seeing is showing a warmer and drier start to fall. Now, of course, I've heard a lot of people talk about this. Everybody asks me, was this event caused by climate change? While climate science is really reluctant to attribute any one single event to human-caused climate change, especially like this wind event, there is broad consensus that climate change is driving higher temperatures, changes in precipitation patterns, and changes in drought cycles across the globe, including the Western United States and Oregon. Also, we have substantial warming occurring in our oceans, where, for example, in the Eastern Pacific, sea surface temperatures have been 3 to 5 degrees warmer this summer than the long-term average. This in turn heats the atmosphere and reinforces the weather pattern that caused the wind event in the first place. How likely are wind events like this to occur in the future? Well, we know that these have happened in the past. And while we know that, their low frequency occurrence means that we do not have as much knowledge of all the mechanisms that drive them as we would like. However, extreme events are expected to change in magnitude and strength over time as atmospheric warming continues. This would mean that strong offshore wind events like this would likely occur more frequently in the future and potentially be stronger when they do. So those are my comments at this point. I will let whoever the moderator is, Bree, if you're still there, take it over from here.
Thanks, Greg. I'm not sure if Bree is back on the line yet, but next up is Benjamin Thiel. He's he works for the USDA's Risk Management Agency, and he's the director for Oregon and Washington there. Also, I just wanted to tell the panelists that I've enabled your permissions to be able to show your video. If you want to make this a little bit more personal, you can. There you go. Hi, Greg. You can show your panelists are able to show their videos now. So I'll turn it over to Benjamin.
Hello, this is Ben Thiel. I'm not going to show my video. My face is good enough, at least for radio. So as mentioned, I'm the director of the Spokane Regional Office of RMA, which assists in the administration of federal crop insurance. So I'm going to kind of give an overview about crop insurance and then talk a little more generally about the situation at hand facing grape growers in regards to wildfires and smoke. So federal crop insurance entails offering hundreds of different insurance products. The product offerings include coverage for production loss, revenue loss, price decline. Insurance covers, from federal crop insurance, we're covering row crops, livestock, specialty crops, organics, dairy, grazing land, and more. A key point about crop insurance is that coverage is for natural causes of loss only, like excessive moisture, drought, fire, hail, wind, freeze. We do not cover any forms of man-made cause of loss. So RMA, my agency, is involved with crop insurance in that we provide reinsurance to insurance providers. We design and develop the policies, and we provide subsidy for the policies thus sold to producers out there. And the subsidies make crop insurance more affordable. Multi-peril crop insurance does not exist in the private sector only. The delivery of crop insurance and how it's structured is unique in that it's a public-private industry system where producers talk to a crop insurance agent to get a policy, which is then serviced by an insurance company that does the underwriting. They collect the premium, and if a loss occurs, they send it a loss adjuster that pays any indemnity claim. So a producer that wants a policy for grapes has to sign up by a sales closing date of November 20th, say for the 2021 crop year. So for crop insurance this year, a producer would have had to sign up by that sales closing date as of last year, November 20th, 2019 for the 2020 crop year. This is also the deadline as you go from year to year to make any changes to your existing policy. Say you want to change the coverage levels, which that's the trigger point. That's like a deductible. That's the trigger point in which a amount of production loss would start triggering an indemnity payment. The range for coverage levels for grapes can go from a minimum of CAT coverage, which is 50% of the approved yield at 55% price selection. This is the lowest form of coverage. Some people would deem it to be the most affordable because you're paying just one set fee regardless of the crop year or the amount of crop you're insuring. Typically, most producers, though, do buy-up coverage that ranges from 50% to 85% with 100% of the price coverage. A key distinction in this delivery system is that in the event of a loss, my agency isn't involved, nor will we know all the key factors that occur in an individual loss, as far as the exact location, the amount of acres, all the elements, attributes, aspects of that individual loss. That is the role of a loss adjuster from the insurance company, to follow my agency, RMA's developed loss procedures. So what I'll be further covering is more general information about what to consider in the event of a loss or damage to your grapes. To start, I want to pause for a moment and elaborate more about crop insurance coverage for fire. As I already said, crop insurance only covers natural causes, which means it does not cover man-made causes of loss. If the ignition source of a fire is the result of human activity, it's not covered. If lightning causes a fire, it is covered. Lightning is natural. However, a fire may have been ignited due to an uninsured cause of loss, but spread due to an insured cause of loss, such as excessive heat, drought, or excessive wind. So in other words, the wildfire spread due to other insurable conditions. So even if the initial source is man-made, the smoke damage could still potentially be covered. Again, this isn't me or my agency making that determination. This is done during the claims process with your loss adjuster in establishing an insurable cause of loss. So if you, the insured producer, suspect you might have damage to your grapes, your duty per the crop insurance policy is that you, as the insured producer, must notify your crop insurance agent within 72 hours of initial discovery of damage or loss of production. This can be done by phone, and then later it needs to be confirmed in writing within 15 days. You also need to notify if you file a notice of loss, you also need to notify if you intend to not harvest the crop. And there's also some date parameters around that you should let your insurance company know within 7 days when you normally harvest that you intend not to harvest. So if you suspect damage, do not harvest or destroy the crop without first talking to your agent and subsequently the crop insurance company, and likely the loss adjuster involved with there. So key point, definitely do not destroy your crop without filing that notice of loss and talking to that agent and loss adjuster prior to doing that, because potentially you put any claim of indemnity in jeopardy. So for smoke taint, again, you must file that notice of loss. Crop insurance does not cover an insured producer's inability to market the crops. We don't insure the market supply and demand. Again, if there's something where it's just a buyer is looking at that a certain variety, there's an oversupply, they don't really want it, they can't use smoke taint as an excuse not to buy it, and thus crop insurance paying for that. Crop insurance covers actual physical damage for insurable cause of loss. So how can crop insurance cover smoke taint in grapes? Grape production may be adjusted for quality deficiencies from smoke. There must be documentation of the smoke's impact to the grapes. This then requires a lab test with test results that show the presence of smoke chemical markers. Then subsequently, you must also prove you are unable to market your grapes due to this damage, like a rejection letter for smoke taint from the buyer. And then in order to have your grapes tested for quality deficiency, you have to submit a sample of your grapes to a lab to be tested. This is something you should discuss with your insurance company and a loss adjuster. It is on the insured to submit the sample, but the loss adjuster might assist you with the sampling process. There also could be, depending on the circumstances, producer's decision whether to harvest or not harvest, the insurance company could grant approval for the insured to also leave a representative strip of the crop out in the field. So at this point, that's kind of everything I wanted to cover about crop insurance. I understand there's probably likely going to be some questions brought up part of the panel process, but I'll turn it back over to the moderator and go from there.
Okay, that's good. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks for that, Ben. Any questions specifically related to Ben? We did have one come in, which I think you mostly covered. Ben, if wildfire is deemed human caused, not by the insured, is coverage potentially revoked?
So again, that's going to depend on the individual unique circumstances of where the loss occurred and all the events of that cause of loss. So not being familiar, not living over there, not being there directly firsthand, that'll be a decision between working with the insured, again, filing that notice of loss, irregardless of what they suspect the ignition source of the fire to be. They need to still file that notice of loss with their crop insurance agent. And then whether the wildfire physically actually damages the crop or they suspect smoke taint, they're filing that notice of loss with the agent. It goes to the insurance company. There's a conversation generally from the insurance company to the insured producer, anywhere from 24 to 48 hours that they're responding to that producer, and then a determination on whether the producer is going to harvest or not harvest, and then the process of a loss adjuster potentially coming out to do an appraisal of that crop. In determining if there's actually an insured cause of loss for fire, there's going to be looking at about the ignition source. And again, I can't say, we don't set whether any one fire, my agency or myself doesn't set whether any one fire is man-made cause of loss, but to give kind of a basic example, say a wheat field that's near a freeway, a motorist drives by and flips out a cigarette and it burns up that field. That is a man-made cause of loss. That's going to be uninsurable for fire by federal crop insurance. There may be other forms of insurance that exist out in the private sector that might cover it for property casualty or fire peril insurance. However, if that cigarette being flipped out of the window that burns up the field would have normally only burned up part of the field, or would have only, through normal control and response by local authorities, would have only done a certain amount of damage, and there happened to be other conditions involved, like high winds that blew it out beyond normal control, then there's consideration that that man-made cause has been converted to a natural cause. And
Great.
I mean, based on the previous presenters' comments and known sort of windstorm and timing of when fires were started, I would generally assume that most of the fires there, whether they were initially started man-made, that natural causes exacerbated the fires to create the smoke in the area.
Okay. Another question we have for you, Ben, is as we'll learn from other speakers, we might be able to avoid smoke taint by harvesting some of the crop, for example, as rosé, and that's a debatable assumption there. How does that impact the rest of the insurance claim, Ben?
I guess I don't know.
Yeah, if the grower harvests the fruit and then later the winery rejects the crop. Is that possibly a question for George Harris, who is on the panel?
So I guess I don't know the background of, or the intent of, what if you are unable to market the grape for what it was intended to be, and then you produce rosé that's maybe of a lower value. It kind of depends on what I have no idea what the value of rosé is. I think you would still have, it potentially could be covered, but there's two things that are key here. Again, is you have to have lab tests. It has to be some physical damage to the crop in order for quality coverage to cover, or for insurance to cover the crop. And in order to prove that you have smoke taint, you have to have the lab tests, and then you have to have rejection from a buyer, or it's generally known in the area that there's smoke taint prevalent and buyers are not accepting the grapes. And so then I don't know a producer's decision on converting it to a rosé channel. I guess I'm not familiar with that. Not familiar with grapes and wine production enough to know what that means.
then is the crop insurance directly related to the price per ton price, or is it covering the farming costs?
I mean, generally in theory, crop insurance is covering the farming costs subject to a deductible, but we also have, we set price elections for the insurance itself. So your yield on the crop, your individual yield, your history of growing the crop, you have a yield times the price that we establish gives you overall insurance guarantee. And so if rosé results in a lower price, depending on how much lower of a price, potentially the quality adjustment could apply.
Bree, this is George Harris. Ben's kind of correct on there. When you get into that situation of the making that determination of the damage, you need to be working with the adjusters on that and the sampling procedures that they're going to find acceptable to be able to document their files. But there has to be some kind of determination made to the extent of, what damage did occur to the grapes from the smoke. And so that's going to be a key component. But the first step, if someone does have crop insurance in place, is to be able to get that notice of loss open so that the adjuster can be in communication with the producer as early as possible in the process, so that the producer can make good decisions about harvesting or not harvesting and what type of samples need to be taken.
Yeah, and then can you speak to the backlog of sampling, and if results cannot be achieved until after harvest, does the determination need to be prior to grapes being harvested, or is it just an existence of smoke at a later date?
So yeah, I am aware that there's a backlog in testing samples. No, the samples don't have to be tested before harvest and likely won't be tested before harvest. It's the insurer's decision whether to harvest regardless of timing of lab tests. So again, the insured needs to make sure that they provide that notice of loss and that they've talked with the insurance company, and the insurance company performs an appraisal if the insured does not intend to harvest. But if the insured is still intending to harvest, but they don't know whether they have smoke taint due to this backlog, I've been told, I don't know, but I understand that samples are frozen and will be tested later. As long as you've already filed your notice of loss and still been in communication with the insurance company, this shouldn't be an issue. This backlog is going to it's obviously creating a delay in knowing you have smoke taint. It's going to delay on determining if an indemnity is due and receiving that indemnity, but the ability to receive an indemnity, again, depends on the circumstances, but you should be eligible for receiving an indemnity if an indemnity is due. It's just, again, it's becoming more of a timing issue. We are also actively trying to find other labs that could do testing, whether it's another USDA agency, academic institutions. We're out looking and inquiring and see if there are other avenues.
Great, and we might have some follow-up answers for you there, Ben, towards the end of the call with Elizabeth Tomasino. And I know that ETS on their website has a list of available labs who are also doing testing outside of ETS. The final question on is there a smoke effect marker scale with the RMA that you use to determine smoke effect losses, or is any presence of smoke support it? Does that support a loss?
So we don't set any baselines. The lab tests confirm that they're chemical markers. And as I understand, the labs themselves don't provide any language that says, that identifies that the sample as being, yes, it's smoke tainted or not. It's more just, they give test results and all these various variables on the spectrum of the tests that they run. But it's, if you have the chemical markers that can then substantiate that it was impacted by smoke. And then subsequently, if you are rejected, if you're unable then to market those grapes and the rejection is due to smoke taint, then it's kind of proved, it's sort of, you have those things then in hand to work with that loss adjuster on getting in claim for indemnity.
Great. Thank you for that clarification, Ben.
You know, Bree, if I could just offer one quick thought, it's a very, very common question we get. What's the coverage percentage in Oregon? And Ben, when he said he's from RMA, that's the USDA's risk management agency. Their data shows that 32% of Oregon wine grape acreage is crop insured. That is less than half the level in both of our neighboring states. But it is a very common question we get, and you heard Ben comment on the importance of the November 20th deadline for next year's season. But 32% is the number many people are looking for.
Yeah, that number sounds about right. And I know that we've been actively trying to increase those numbers. We always are. That's a part of why I'm here, is we provide education outreach. I know this is kind of, at this time of year, we're talking about loss situations, but I do have individuals on my staff that do engage with outreach to wine growers, and everywhere's a little different as far as anyone's determination on what they're willing to accept for risk, and some of that could depend on their scale of operation, the number of acres they have, how much they're at financial risk. If you're a smaller grower, more of a hobby farm, you might, in a way, self-insure by not taking crop insurance. However, if you can't get by from year to year due to a significant loss, that crop insurance is your business, your livelihood. I mean, if grape production for wine is your livelihood or your business, then crop insurance, I think, is a tool. If you aren't already utilizing it, it's a tool you should consider now and into the future for protecting your risk, whether it's for smoke taint or other forms of natural causes of loss.
Great. Thank you, Ben. And we're going to have to leave it there for now. But Ben, if it's okay with you, I'll collect any additional questions surrounding insurance, and I will send them on to you regarding crop insurance, and we can perhaps either have a follow-up call or a response to those questions that come through.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Bree, before we move on to the next speaker, I just want to encourage each speaker, after they're done, to go and review the Q&A box, which is different from the chat box, because there may be some questions that are still hanging out there, and they can be answered live for all to see during this discussion.
Thanks, Jess. I'd like to now introduce Professor Elizabeth Tomasino from Oregon State University, who will lead our discussion on current smoke research and enology best practices. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thanks for having me. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Great. So I'm gonna, just before we get into the research going on, I've received lots and lots of emails, and I know Paul, Patty and James has as well, that at the end of last week, OSU got the okay from higher up that we are starting to put the testing in place for smoke compounds. Documentation is going to come out on Monday of next week with the details on that and how to sample both grapes and wine. We are providing, we do want to have two caveats to that. We do have limited amount of samples we can go through each day. Currently, it looks like between 30 and 40 samples per day we can process. We're attempting to get another machine online to hopefully be able to get that up to 40 or 50, but we are going to start get the information out and collecting those samples next week to start analysis for that. We did also want to say, because of the limited amount of samples we can get through per day, there is not a guarantee that you would get results before picking or winemaking for that. Did want to put that out there. But again, information is going to be coming out about testing available through OU for smoke compounds in grapes and wine for that. Now I'm going to go on to just a little bit about research. There's a lot of research going on, ongoing, really wanting to provide tools for industry. I'm part of a team that includes UC Davis and Washington State University working on smoke research. We've recently had a number of conversations with the Australia Wine Research Institute, as they are aware of what's going on here, and we're really great at providing a lot of information. So if you are looking for some questions on processing, please do visit the Australian Wine Research Institute webpage that is posted under the toolkit. They've been doing work on this for more than 15 years. A lot of the questions I've seen, they actually have some answers for that. I did want to take the time to provide just a little bit of information about a handful of questions that people have been asking me about things. One of the most recent ones has to do with the type of smoke matters for impact of smoke on your grapes. And what I mean by that is fresh versus old smoke. So fresh smoke is really considered that smoke when you went outside and it smelled like a wildfire. It smelled like smoke. You could see it, but that smell was there. Fresh smoke is the smoke that is very problematic when it comes into contact with grapes, because it has all the smoke compounds in it, and those get absorbed through the grape skin. I know down here in Corvallis a couple of days ago, there was a shift of wind, and while we still can see smoke, we can no longer smell smoke. And that smoke is considered older smoke, and older smoke doesn't contain those same smoke compounds that are problematic, and is not considered as much of a problem for smoke compounds in grapes. So there is a difference based on the type of smoke you have. And one of the easiest ways to sort of figure that out is if you go outside and if it smells like smoke or not. I did also want to mention, I've had an opportunity to talk with several winemakers from Australia. So they had some very bad fires in 2019, 2020, and even previously before that. And one of the things they stressed to me was that not all grapes are equal for absorption of smoke compounds. So you might find that doing your micro ferments to figure out if you have a problem, one grape variety is smelling very smoky, but you might have another grape right next to that one that's not showing any problems whatsoever. And they did stress that doing those small ferments prior to picking, if you can, was something that is actually quite standard in Australia for trying to figure out the extent of smoke exposure that your grapes have. So for instance, apparently, I can't remember the region in Australia, but Pinot Noir was greatly affected one year, but they had Chardonnay in the same area that had the same smoke exposure, and the Chardonnay was not impacted nearly as much as that. Do be aware about grape variety, or the type of grape matters for that. And then I did want to give a little information about the type of sensory you're looking for smoke exposure, particularly when you're evaluating your microferments. So the Australian Wine Research Institute sort of gives 3 different levels. You have a green light, in which your ferments taste amazing, not a problem. An orange light, where you start to notice something, and then a red light, which is essentially there's not much you can do with those grapes. So the sensory for sort of that red light area is you've done your ferments and you haven't even tasted the grapes, but you can smell smoke. That means you have quite extreme amounts of those smoke compounds in there, if you automatically can smell that smoke and you haven't even tasted it. And the winemakers that I've spoken to have said there's not a lot you can do with those types of grapes. Where it starts to get a little tricky is sort of that orange light area, or what we'd call the gray area, where you're starting to get light to medium affected smoke exposure. And what that means is you might not be able to smell it, but when you put the wine in your mouth and taste it, you start to get ash and a little bit of smoke on the palate. And that suggests you have had some smoke absorption in your grapes for it, but you might be able to do something for that, whether it's changing some processing or even potentially declassifying your wine to some different tiers for that. So remember that sort of orange area is when you can start to taste it on the palate, and that area of you're not going to be able to do a lot is when you can smell it and you haven't even tasted the wine for it. Also be aware that people have different sensitivities to be able to taste smoke. So please make sure you're tasting with multiple people. We recommend at least 5 people, if not more, to figure out some of those things for it. I'm not going to go into much more. I'm trying to answer questions on the Q&A, and I've been sending that to everyone. But there is a lot of information out there available through the toolkit from research. And what I'm very excited to hear next is about the microferments that Carolyn Merrill has done. That is something we've heard repeatedly up and down the West Coast, as well as from Australia, particularly if you're not able to get your numbers as fast as you would like. It is highly recommended to do the microferments. I know California has released an updated protocol for how to do your microferments, and that has been posted under the toolkit as well. So that is highly recommended for it. But I will try and go through, answer a few questions now if we have them, but also go through the Q&A list as people post.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, and she will keep track of those. And as mentioned earlier, we will keep track of the questions that come through, and we will direct them to the speakers. But we are very short on time. We only have so much time to get through all of these questions. So we are trying to really get through and give every speaker some time. And with that, we would like to welcome Dr. Carolyn Merrill from Jackson Family Wines to share with us her learnings on the more than 350 microfermentations that they have conducted. Thanks for joining us, Carolyn.
Thank you. Let me just, so I sent my slides in. I don't know if you want me to share my screen or if, and we have some photos.
Caroline, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and see if you need permission to share or how that works. There you go.
Oh, perfect. All right. All right. So at Jackson Family Wines, we have a number of facilities and wineries down in California and Oregon. And in California, we unfortunately have been under thick to moderate amounts of smoke for probably about 3 to 4 weeks now. So we got a little head start on Oregon in terms of bucket ferments and trying to monitor for smoke taint. So we have done as a company probably about 350 to 400 bucket ferments. From our point of view, they are really the fastest way to evaluate your risk and just be able to see if you're going to have a problem. We do have a number of facilities that have their own take on how to do bucket ferments. And so things, everyone does it a little bit differently, but I'm just going to share a little bit about what has seemed to work the best for us. In terms of vineyard sampling, just making sure that you are sampling a large enough area in your vineyard to be representative and to be realistic. So the number one thing that we have seen down here in California is that different elevation blocks are affected differently. So things that are at higher elevation tend to pick up more smoke taint, generally because for us anyway, they're sitting in a thicker layer of smoke. So if you have a vineyard that's fairly flat, you can probably sample, all varieties of that, or I'm sorry, your one variety. If you have multiple blocks that are flat, you could probably combine them into one microferment. If your vineyard is at multiple elevations, that's when you really want to start separating out block by block your microferment so that you could kind of identify at what point the elevation becomes problematic. Some of the main questions that we've received from our internal winemakers about bucket ferments is from reds, can I just throw whole clusters in the bucket or do I need to destem? So we did have some winemakers do a trial on that. And what we saw is that whole cluster really tends to extract less guaiacol on the bucket scale. So it kind of underestimated our total risk. We haven't seen this work on a commercial scale, unfortunately. So whole cluster on a commercial scale doesn't necessarily extract less, but in the bucket it is. So we definitely recommend that you destem your grapes, break them up as much as you can when you're throwing them into the bucket or the small scale fermenter. The other question that comes up frequently is what to do about whites. And so we, as a company, recommend that our winemakers are fermenting their whites on the skins in the bucket, just to kind of give them a worst case scenario, highest risk look. We do have some facilities that like to do bucket ferments where they press juice and then do a second bucket ferment where their white is on the skins, knowing that your risk falls somewhere in the middle. Because even if you're hand harvesting and trying to get it off the skins quickly, that fruit's going to spend some time in the press where it can extract some of these compounds. So for white wines, we tend to try to evaluate our highest risk, which would be fermenting them on the skins. And then from our perspective, we really just want to see these bucket ferments go through fermentation quickly. So what we recommend to our winemakers is just add a really high dose rate of a fast fermenting yeast strain, get it through fermentation as quickly as you can, add some DAP to help it go, and then try to keep these buckets as warm as possible. And I think that's been our biggest challenge as a company, is just keeping these buckets warm, because you'll get more extraction the warmer they are, and it will help these ferments go faster. The other question that comes up fairly frequently is timing of bucket ferments. So let's say you're still 3 weeks out from a pick. Is it too early to do a bucket ferment? And I think this question really comes down to, are you working with estate fruit or grower fruit? If you're working with estate fruit, it's a lot easier to sample multiple times throughout harvest, rather than with grower fruit, you have a little bit more restrictions on how frequently you can go into the vineyard and sample. But if you already have smoke, it's a good idea to do a bucket ferment now, even if you're not going to pick for a few weeks, and just see where you are now. That smoke taint is not going to go away. So if you're already, as Elizabeth said, in that red light zone, you'd probably prefer to know it early. And then do maybe another bucket ferment the closer you get to harvest, if you were looking okay, and just see kind of where you're headed. It helps give you kind of some perspective on historical information and kind of where you're going. So these photos are of one of our facilities that was doing quite a few bucket ferments. The photo on the left is kind of where they started. So this is just the traditional bucket ferment. They had destemmed grapes, thrown them in a bucket, and inoculated. And then they were realizing that these buckets weren't getting warm enough. This facility didn't have enough room in the cellar, so they are outside. So what they were trying to do then was, can they put a heating blanket on top of them to help for the cold nights, help keep this fermentation going, as well as getting extraction of these compounds. So they did buy this big heating blanket and just put it right on top of the buckets, which worked fairly well. But they were finding that it was getting kind of gross and dirty. And so what they ended up doing was moving the heating pad from on top down to the bottom. So they wrapped a pallet in the heating blanket, then wrapped that in like a painting tarp so that it wouldn't get sticky and covered in grapes. And then in this photo, what they were doing was they had lids on most of these to keep out fruit flies and ash, but they didn't have enough lids for all of them. So they found this big piece of cardboard just to put on top, because this was a time point in an area where we were getting quite a bit of falling ash. And they didn't want to have ash from the atmosphere kind of going into their buckets, and they really just wanted an idea of what was in the buckets on the grapes themselves. So this has worked really well for them to help keep things warm, help keep the fermentations going, help with some of the extraction. The other thing that we started to look at was, in California, we had this smoke fairly early, and for our Bordeaux winemakers, they still had a few weeks before harvest. Then we had a 115-degree heat spike, and everything started to ripen. And so these bucket ferments that we thought we had time on, we thought we had weeks before harvest, really got compressed down, and we could no longer wait a week for a bucket ferment before we could have results. So what we came up with was, if heat is what's helping us go through the fermentation faster, why can't we just take this on a smaller scale, put it in a water bath to keep the temperature up, and help these ferments go faster? So what we started doing was using a sous vide, because you can use a normal lab water bath as well, but if you don't have one, sous vides are a lot cheaper. So we bought this kind of tub and a sous vide and some mason jars, and basically just crushed our fruit into the mason jar and inoculated there. What we found was that our ferments were finishing in 2 to 3 days rather than a week. And so it was a way that we were able to really speed up this process, if you don't have time to wait for a traditional bucket ferment, to help it go faster. I think the one concern here is that because you're taking such a small sample of grapes, that it won't necessarily be representative of your entire vineyard. So making sure that if you do go sample the vineyard, pull grapes off of every cluster that you've picked from different areas on the cluster, try to get as much of a representative sample as you can. In terms of the temperature of this, we've just been keeping it at the upper temperature limit of your yeast strain. You want it to be warm, but at the same time, you still need your yeast to be alive. So definitely check with your manufacturer about what yeast strain you're using and what the upper temperature limit it can endure is. And then make sure that you keep these mixed. So we found a sauerkraut masher, which I didn't know was a tool, but they have some tools. It looks like a muddler, but it's specifically made for mason jar ferments of vegetables and of sauerkraut. So it fits really nicely in the lid to help you kind of keep these mixed and help kind of punch down the little mason jars. We did a very quick comparison of what our mason jar ferments looked like compared to our bucket ferments. And what we saw was that they matched up fairly well in terms of free glycol. So the 4 samples on the left are all white wine. They were all Chardonnay, and then on the right is all Pinot Noir from a fairly heavily smoke impacted region. What we saw was that the mason jar was always a bit higher than the bucket, probably because we had consistent heat, we were getting consistent extraction. And then the one spot where it really deviated was when we had high levels of glycol. So the mason jar just extracted a lot more glycol in an area or in a wine that was fairly highly exposed. But they did do a pretty good job of predicting where our bucket ferments were going to be, just in a shorter time frame. The one thing I'll say about this, we are working with Tom Collins out of WSU to validate this. This is only 8 wines, and it's a fairly new idea. So he has, I believe, about 80 bucket ferments that he's going to compare to the mason jar ferments as well, to kind of validate that this actually is a good predictive tool, and make sure that it's something that we could use going forward with a good degree of confidence. The other thing I'll say about bucket ferments is kind of how we interpret them. So we have seen in the past that bucket ferments tend to slightly underestimate what your commercial drain is going to be. We think this is probably just because, skin contact time, your wine's in a commercial fermenter a lot longer than it's going to be in a bucket. And your commercial fermenters are probably getting up hotter and having more extraction. So we have seen, this was not data from this year, this is older data, but we see that, bucket ferments that ranged from 4 to 5.5 part per billion glycol, the commercial fermenter was always higher. And sometimes it was 6 and sometimes it was up to 9. So when you're interpreting these, just know that you might get a little bit more extraction on a commercial scale, and just keep that in mind when you taste. As Elizabeth said, the first thing that we tend to look for is that ashy aftertaste, because that will come before your main smoky aromas. But the one feedback that I've heard from a lot of our winemakers is that because you're picking these bucket ferments when they're underripe, you do get kind of a harsher mouthfeel than you would necessarily be expecting from a ripe wine. And so we've had some feedback that, maybe we're confusing a little bit some of this unripe bitterness with smoke taint as an ashy aftertaste. So just keep that in mind, that these bucket ferments are going to be underripe. They're going to have a slightly different mouthfeel than what you're used to, and kind of go into the tasting knowing that. The other thing that we've seen fairly frequently is that these bucket ferments tend to go reductive, and it's very easy to mistake reduction and smoke taint. So if you feel like your bucket ferment went reductive, adding copper sulfate will help clear some of that out, so you can try to get at some of that underlying smokiness. And the other thing, tasting smoke tainted wines gives you palate fatigue very quickly. That ashy aftertaste does not tend to go away quickly. So if you're doing this, make sure you give yourself at least 2 to 3 minutes in between these wines, if not longer. And we really recommend that people are only tasting around 6 wines in one sitting, and just giving yourself a break so that you can kind of help counteract some of that palate fatigue. So with that, I just want to I have to thank, this is our director of R&D, Tori. The sous vide idea was really his brainchild. So big thank you to Tori and all of our facilities in California and Oregon, and thank you to the Oregon Wine Board. And I can take some questions.
Carolyn, do you mind if we share your presentation with our members?
Sure.
Thank you. And also, do you have where can the markers be found for smoke sensory impact? Are you using a guideline from UC Davis or the AWRI?
In terms of what level, like threshold levels, or?
Yeah, threshold levels.
We tend to use the ETS recommendation, which is, roughly above 4 part per billion glycol in whites and 6 part per billion glycol in reds. They had seen that was kind of in the past a good estimation. We do have the capability to measure these compounds in-house, so we are doing both analysis and sensory. But we, our winemakers tend to like doing the sensory on it as well.
And Carolyn, can you also, if you have a number of microfermentations going, is there a minimum time that you need to be waiting in between? I imagine this tannin is going to build up quite heavily on your palate. Are your team finding a recommended sensory break?
So we recommend not to taste more than 6, in a sitting, but I would say it will be pretty dependent on the wine. And we do recommend that people give themselves, at least probably a minimum of 3 minutes in between the wines, because it does build up very quickly.
This is Elizabeth. I will just back that up. We recommend 2.5 to 3 minutes for that. And yeah, you can't, I know some places who try and do 15 to 20 wines, and you can't do that with these wines for it. You start to lose your ability.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And final question.
I just got a question coming through from Lee that you may not be able to see. It says, how well do fresh grape samples correlate to the microferments?
So if you did analysis on grape samples? Is that, if I'm understanding the question correctly?
Yes. Yeah.
So we've seen, and I know ETS has seen this in the past as well, that grape samples tend to be 3 to 5 times below what your microferment samples are going to be. Grapes have these compounds primarily in the bound forms, and then through fermentation, you're releasing them. So it tends to be 3 to 5 times lower in grapes than in wine, which is why we really recommend for our facilities that they do these bucket ferments so that they can taste and tell where they're at.
And the final question, have you run bucket fermentations on grapes that have not had any exposure as a control? And if so, what levels were detected in the control?
So we haven't, unfortunately, in California this year, a lot of the state has been under smoke. So trying to find some fresh grape samples from this year that haven't been exposed is a little challenging. We did do a project in combination with UC Davis last year where we looked at UC Davis scale, so university scale fermenters of Pinot, and just looking at baseline levels in Pinot, we did see that in final commercial ferments, you could have up to 2 part per billion glycol in Pinot. But keep in mind that the bucket ferment is going to probably underestimate what your commercial ferment is going to do. But we did see some baseline glycol in Pinot.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm sure there will be more data and research on that coming out as well. I'd now like to welcome Alyssa Jacobson, winemaking director at Joe Got Wines. And Alyssa has had multiple years of experience with smoke vintages, and she will give a short presentation and answer your questions. Thanks, Alyssa.
Thank you, Bree, and thanks, Tom, for having me, and Jess and Christina for helping host. I believe I have some slides if you guys want to start those. So when California thinks about smoke exposure and wildfires, most of our first memories of a large fire had lots of smoke impact was in 2008. 55,000 acres burned from mid-June to mid-July. This was post-veraison for many Mendocino and Anderson Valley wine growers, and what we think is the most susceptible time for smoke impact on wine grapes. Like Oregon now, we had not experienced this before, and most of us picked and dealt with whatever impacts we had later. 55,000 acres seemed big for us at the time, but 10 years later in 2018, we had the biggest wildfire in California history, burning more than 325,000 acres. In 2008, I had a lot of Cabernet from Mendocino County. I remember the grapes being dumped into the hopper and the smell of campfire coming off the truck and being shocked at the impact. That year we spent a lot of money on RO and eventually were able to take most of the impact out of the wines, stripping of course the color and tannins along with the smoke compounds. Mendocino was only a small portion of our blend that year, so we were able to blend the treated wine into more extracted wines from other regions, and our result was clean and marketable. Anderson Valley wasn't as lucky, as a lot of their wines were single vineyards and not blended with wines from outside the area. People began to market their wines creatively and sold their wine out of the tasting room with a story of how fires impacted their vineyards. Now it's time to think ahead about what your marketing strategy will be. California has now experienced fires for 4 years in a row. What we once thought was a one-time occurrence has turned into what we now call fire season. As an industry, we deserve to be cohesive, collaborative, and smart. We are all in this together, and we need to make good decisions to protect our growers and our wine brands. Hope is not a business strategy. We need to be smart, collaborative, and make decisions together now, as well as for the future. We also need to help fund our brilliant researchers to continue their work. To be clear, everyone should be aware that as a global industry, we are still in the infancy stages of research on smoke exposure. So the West Coast Smoke Exposure Task Force plans to put out a frequently asked question sheet shortly, hopefully next week, with some guidance around vineyard and winery solutions, as well as information on how to use crop insurance. The goals of the West Coast Smoke Exposure Task Force are to help identify, develop guidance and best practices around communication amongst wineries and growers, to help identify risk assessment tools for the industry, to improve crop insurance as a more effective tool, and to help support our smoke exposure researchers at Oregon State, Washington State, UC Davis by means of grant money, as well as supporting and communicating their knowledge to the industry. Elizabeth and Carolyn talked about how microfermentations can help evaluate your wines. With the backlog at commercial labs, this is really our only tool this year in Oregon to evaluate your risk level for picking, unless you have an internal lab, GCMS. We encourage all wineries to have an open discussion with their growers about how they plan to assess their risk and what their tolerance will be. The more communication, the better. Even if you don't have a plan or don't know what to do, you're not alone. This is uncharted territory for the Willamette Valley. Discuss with your growers what you can afford and what risk you can take. Now is the time to be creative. There are many risk-sharing solutions. Crop insurance, as we heard, is a great tool in these circumstances. We do recommend growers have crop insurance for these types and many more situations that arise in agriculture, including rot and botrytis. As Benjamin mentioned, the deadline for buying crop insurance is November 20th, so think ahead about contacting your agent soon for 2021. Adding also to what he said on the winery side, current standards for handling a rejection claim require any elevated glycol numbers from a certified lab, which can now be an internal winery lab. Elevated definitions are going to be covered in our fact sheet coming out next week. Also, crop insurance has updated their process to allow not only grape samples, but the micro-ferment samples to be used in the claim. Always work with your individual adjuster for specifics though. So one method of risk assessment, and especially if you do have crop insurance and can open a claim, is to pick the grapes, have the winery ferment, test, and assess the resulting wine. We do recommend that you have a secondary contract for this scenario, as once the grapes cross the scale, the winery has accepted the grapes and your grape contract is completed. In this instance, grapes and wine need to be kept completely separate and the vineyard identity needs to be tracked and traceable. For example, if you own the fruit and the resulting wine is downgraded to a lower wine tier, the crop insurance may be able to cover the difference in the wine tier. If your winery partner deems the wine unusable after fermentation, you can still claim crop insurance as well. Other creative scenarios that you could work out with your growers include paying your grower depending on what wine tier the wine goes into at different discounted rates. So showing a chain of custody when you're taking your samples can be important for traceability and claims. Taking pictures of sampling the fruit, geotagging yourself sampling, including lot numbers, contract IDs, these are all good ideas. Also holding grape samples in your freezer can be used for later assessment for growers and wineries alike. So this is our bucket fermentation setup that we have in Oregon. We actually have been using heaters, kind of just portable heaters next to these bins to keep everything warm, because as we noticed, they don't tend to hold their heat as well, so keeping them warm is important. So what have I learned over the last 12 years? That sensory is the most important tool for assessment and helps you understand the lab numbers. We need commercial lab numbers for rejections claims, crop insurance, and consistency amongst wineries, but be sure to taste and look at those numbers alongside your sensory. Glycol doesn't always correlate to smoke impact, as there are 13 compounds that labs like the Australian Wine Research Institute test for that are all part of smoke impact in your wine. High glycol usually does correlate to trouble though. Low levels are the gray areas where sensory is important to help you evaluate those numbers. Taste your wines, as everybody else has said here. Taste your wines with growers and winemakers alike. Sensory panels to evaluate your wines make growers feel more confident in your decisions. We should also learn from each other, and the more consensus we have as a wine community on the smoke impacts, the more we are collaborating and all aligned on the outcomes for now and for the future. The white microfermentations on skins are a good indicator of risk, as Caroline said. The gentle cellar operations can make you have cleaner microferments due to your treatments in the cellars though. The red microferments, however, in my 2018 experience, were always worse in the cellar once the wine was made due to more extraction. And Caroline also mentioned she noticed the same thing. So be aware of that. Compounds take the bound compounds take 6 to 12 months to release. The wines only show the initial impact during ferment. After ML, you will continue to see the bounds releasing. Aging in wine's acidic conditions continue to release the compounds slowly. Don't treat your wines with RO until at least spring of the following year, when you have a good amount of the bounds released into their free treatable form. If you bottle your wines earlier than spring, be aware of what might come out later. Once you add oak to your wine, the glycol numbers don't mean much, as they pick up the oak in the analysis. Make the best wine you can. RO and carbon does strip your wine, so you need to start with a bigger wine if you go that route. In California, we have seen flash to top be helpful in creating larger wines that can mask smoke compounds. In Pinot Noir, this approach can be more challenging since it's generally a lighter style of wine. Smoke compounds are in the skins. There are varietal differences in smoke uptake. Speculation in California this year is that thin-skinned varieties like Pinot Noir seem more sensitive than varieties like Chardonnay that show more robust, similar to what Elizabeth just said about the Australians' experience last year. Whites and rosés can have good results on low impacted locations. With high impact, the smoke can actually show greater in these wines since they are less complex. Now, the price point of your wine, and if you are blending into a larger blend or not, can determine what levels of smoke impact or not that you have. Every winery has to make these decisions for themselves. If you think you may not be able to vineyard dozen a wine, but rather use it in an AVA blend, think about what price per ton you need to make that work for your blend and offer your grower a tiered approach depending on what blend the wine makes it into. Smoke exposure is an industry problem and the consumer does not have a risk. We need to fix this issue in the vineyard or the winery. It's sad to leave grapes on the vine, but it's also sad to make wine that has high levels of smoke impact. Learn from this event. Even if you have decided to pick your grapes, perform microferments. Assess the sensory and analysis from the microferments and compare it to what your final wine is like. This will help guide you in future events so you can see how your microferment correlates to your wine made in your cellar. The climate is warming. We may not have another fire event for 10 years, or you may have one next year. Gain experience from this and plan for the future. Think about language in your contracts, what your tolerance levels will be, and get a crop insurance quote. Thanks for your time, everyone. I know there's time for some questions now, and just remember, we're all stronger when we work together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. That's such great information and experience and insights. Thank you very much. And yes, collaboration is key and getting benchmarks. I will throw it back now to Elizabeth Tomasino, knowing that we only have 10 minutes left in this round table. And Elizabeth can see some of the questions that are coming through as well. And Alyssa, I'd ask you if you are able to answer the Q&A questions as well, if they're directly coming through. I did actually have one question for you, Alyssa. With California's ability to blend in a larger percentage of other grape varieties for labeling purposes, how are you seeing the differences between Oregon and California compare in terms of marketability?
Well, we do know varieties like Syrah do have some glycol present. So we have the ability to blend things like that in that can kind of mask. There's a lot of talk about stripping the compounds out, but I think what we've generally seen is it's actually better to mask the compounds. So look for trying to make your wines bigger. Obviously adding some Syrah to Pinot can do that. Look for oak. There's a question on untoasted oak and regular oak. I've actually seen that regular oak and toasted oak helps more due to the fact that it's masking. So generally we're looking for masking effects. That's been my experience with what works the best.
Thanks, Alyssa. Elizabeth, I'll hand it back to you with any questions and also to comment on OSU's testing potential.
Thanks. I'm sorry, we've been going through a bunch of these on here. I unfortunately can't answer. A lot of you appear to have some insurance questions for that. But I will go through I have a whole list of Q&A. So let's go through and ask a few people. I I don't know if any of the winemakers want to talk a little bit who are on the panel, any best practices for fermentation with grapes exposed to smoke. I know I hear a lot of winemakers talking about trying to maybe reduce some extraction or use press fractions and things. Can anyone potentially make some comments on that? Anyone, or I will volunteer someone to do it.
Elizabeth, I mean, I think on the Pinot ends up being a little bit trickier. And with varieties like Cabernet, you can do a big extraction and try to mask some of the aromatics. I think on Pinot, I mean, that's something we can definitely try, although the Australians do sort of keep warning us that we know the smoke compounds are in the skins. I mean, I don't think there's good answers, unfortunately, for this. This is going to be a little bit of, you know, trial and error for you guys. On the Pinot side, all of our California wildfires, for the most part, except for Anderson Valley in 2008, have come during Cabernet season. So we have the most experience in Cabernet.
Anyone else? I know we have a couple other winemakers on the panel.
Elizabeth, perhaps Anthony King can answer that question from our conversation last night with Australia as well, and some of his contacts in California.
So I think that it's all very confusing. What Elisa's been talking about with making bigger wines makes a lot of sense in terms of masking. The Adam from Shaw and Smith and Toll Puddle last night talked about how he basically was relying on the method of trying to not be on the skins very long, which we've heard that from a few Californians from 2008 as well. So there's a couple different ways to approach it. One of the questions, I guess, and I'd go back to Elizabeth on this, is how much time does it take to extract the compounds in maceration? And then before I pass it back to her, I will say that one of the greatest lessons from the conversation last night was that on whites, they did not change their methods at all, meaning that they went through their regular press cycle. They did separate their press fraction on the whites to where, and then kept it separate, but that's a part of their norm. And they also went to barrel with all the lees, which they use a fair bit of lees in their winemaking and didn't have any problems and described them as being some of the best Chardonnays they've made. So on reds, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and with the whites as well, Anthony, it was also a key consideration that they be chilled very heavily as well, very cold pressed.
Yeah, that's right. And then they're also, they mentioned that they're typically starting off with very low pHs, which would technically seem to hydrolyze the bond earlier, but in any case, something that they noted.
Yeah, we've seen, I'm sure Elizabeth would echo this, but we've seen most of the smoke compounds come out within the first 3 days. So kind of keeping that in mind for your extraction. I know there's talk about people trying to pull juice off and put it over clean skins after a day or two, but it doesn't take very long for those smoke compounds to come out.
So
yeah, that's correct.
And so Elisa, the question there is, a lot of people have asked the question about extended maceration. And so that would indicate that, and I've seen a couple of numbers to support the idea that, you know, you don't necessarily need to hold back on the tail end of it. You've basically gotten through a fair portion of what you're going to be extracting of those compounds very early on. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I would say that's the case. Elizabeth, any comments on the extended?
I would agree. I would agree with that. I think that's where we start when people talk about trying to make a complex wine to mask things. While we don't have any research that would support that, that is something where extended maceration, most of the compounds have come out already. So we think that extended maceration is not necessarily, it's not like you're going to double the amount that you have just from extended maceration. Most of what comes out has already come out.
Yeah, and I know this is on our fact sheet, but I know a lot in Oregon, a lot of people like to use whole cluster. And that's something that we're not recommending, as the Racus can have smoke compounds in it as well.
So someone asked a question, winemaking, and I can't remember. I've been in so many conversations about cold soak for it. Anyone have any thoughts about cold soaks? Alyssa, do you guys?
Yeah, I think just what you said last week, Elizabeth, about which enzymes you should or shouldn't use during cold soak. As far as we don't want to use any extraction enzymes that are pulling out any of the extra kind of compounds during the cold soak.
Yeah. And then one person did say something, and this has come up quite a bit, machine harvesting versus hand harvesting. And I know talking to a lot of winemakers, if possible, they do talk about hand harvesting, but I didn't know if over machine harvesting, if possible, but I didn't know if anyone else wanted to make a comment about that.
I would say that's mostly related to whites. Hand harvesting is a lot better for whites, definitely. And you guys in California, that's harder because it's bigger vineyards, but you know, hopefully that's not a problem turning your whites into hand harvesting. Pinot Noir may not matter. The main thing is that you're trying to get rid of any mog. So any leaves, any rachis, all of those are going to have smoke impact. So that's the main thing. Sometimes we see machine harvested fruit be a lot cleaner than hand harvested. So it just kind of depends on how you sort and how you process into your destemmer.
Great, thank you. I did want to make a comment from talking to several winemakers in Australia. The thought was that if you had very badly smoke affected grapes, oh, we'll just make a rosé from it and that'll be fine. You don't make a good rosé out of very smoke affected grapes. That is not necessarily something we recommend if you've done your micro ferments and it's like, oh, you know, it smells really bad. We'll just put it in a rosé because you don't extract things. Because the complexity of rosés are so much less, there's absolutely no masking whatsoever of those smoke compounds. So you have to be really careful if you want to go that route. Let me find another question for everyone.
There was a question about ash, Elizabeth, if you wanted to comment on that, what you're finding as far as ash effect.
There's lots of opinions about ash.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of research about ash, but we do know a couple of things. We know ash do contain some of the smoke compounds. We also know, though, that if you look at the sheer mass of the grapes that you're bringing in versus the amount of ash, the ash is very small compared to that. But there is that thought, if you want to try and sort of reduce things as much as possible, potentially trying to wash that ash off before it goes into wine processing is something you could attempt to do. Again, it's such a small percentage of what's going in. It's really what's already in the grapes that is problematic. And from what I've heard, people are trying to see about washing ash off in the vineyard, but I haven't heard back yet about what they think is the best way to do that. Lee, have you had any success yet? I know you talked about trying a few things. Is she still on?
We've been I'm here. Yep, we have been trying. We've used sprayers with water up to as much water as we can put on the grapes, and then with just a dry tank and a fan running. And neither are hugely successful, to be honest. I think you get a little bit off, but you're blowing as much around the vineyard that's landing somewhere, which could be on the road next to it. And then with the water, we're just, with the sprayer running, we're just not able to get enough water quantity onto each cluster to really rinse them. You know, I think you could use a hand wand on the back of a tank and do it with pretty good success, but I think it sounds a lot easier, and this is me being a vineyard person, it sounds a lot easier to do it at the winery.
Yeah,
Okay.
Lee, this is Tom. You might remember Lee and a few of us were on the phone with some Australians, and they had moved washing to some washing to the sorting table.
And I did want to mention, because someone from Australia did, since they have even worse water problems, they collect that water that they wash ash with, and then it went back into use. And the minute you wash your grapes with ash, you've contaminated that water. So you have to think about how water works in your system for washing things. You don't want that water to go back directly into use. It would need to go through some serious filtration to remove those compounds from it.
Yeah,
Are we still good on time?
There's a question, Elizabeth, if white wines are similar to what you were talking about with rosé, as far as if there's a heavy smoke impact on white wines, can you do anything to reduce the impact?
I do know some people, and this is if you're sort of in that orange zone I talked a little bit about for it. I do know that some people, and I think it's some winemakers in Southern Oregon, have had some success with doing some carbon fining. If you have to add so much carbon, of course, you're going to strip a lot of other things. But I know that has been one thing for some white wines trying. And the AWRI does have trials that had some interesting results about fining, including some rates they recommended, if you wanted to look at that.
Elizabeth, can I ask a couple of questions from the prior questions that came in through registration as well?
Certainly.
So does the level of smoke effect, if present, rise over exposure time, or does the level present stay commensurate with the initial exposure level?
So we do know that multiple exposure to smoke, it goes up. We don't know if there's sort of a threshold where it stops, but we do know that it's sort of, it keeps going up the more smoke exposure you have. That's the best way to answer that.
And is there any data with how many miles from the fire makes the situation serious? If you smell smoke or campfire, does that mean it is in the grapes? How long is the exposure time?
So we don't, unfortunately, have that at the moment. It's something Tom Collins is looking at, hoping to set up some trials for this in Oregon and California as well. It is one of the main goals in the grant we're trying to do, develop a predictive index based off of air quality measurements. So you would have an idea if you're going to have a problem even before you send things to be sampled. But unfortunately, that's going to take a couple of years of work to put that in. Tom Collins has done a little bit for it. We do know that if you have the smoke compounds and they're traveling, they have a half-life of 6 hours. So that's the only thing I can say about distance from the source for it. Things start to decrease by halves once you start getting about 6 hours away.
Great.
Are there any other questions on that list?
Have we addressed the smoke impacts on the barrels? Will there be evidence?
So Alyssa did mention about using barrels. The one thing I can say is this: a couple questions came in about if you're for lack of a better term, causing a problem in your barrels and you can't use it anymore. We don't, it does not appear that if you have smoke affected grapes and you put them in barrel, the barrel is not necessarily going to absorb those and you can never use that barrel again. We don't have a lot of work on that. I know Alyssa talked a little bit about masking, and several of the Australian winemakers talked about using neutral oak or old oak and having quite a bit of luck with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest thing to do is to do just to do kind of like your lab soak trials and see what you feel works the best. But that's where we found in Cabernet, and in Pinot Noir, it might be a little bit different on what you want to use. So I think just do your benchtop trial. There was a question about ozone spraying your grapes, and I know, Elizabeth, I think you and Anita sort of answered this one in a previous webinar, if spraying ozone on your grapes would do anything.
The answer to that is I have no idea, and it's highly unlikely that it would do anything.
Right.
Someone asked if it believes that, oh, go ahead, Bree, you're fine.
You go, Elizabeth, that's fine.
Oh, I was going to say, someone asked if leaves and tissues can absorb and translocate the smoke to the fruit weeks after. Originally, and some of the starting research about 10 years ago, it was thought that the grape leaves absorbed the compounds and then translocated it to the grapes. We now think the primary problem with smoke taint is that it's absorbed through the grape skins. specifically. So while we a tiny bit could come from the leaves, it's very much thought that it is that absorption through the grape skins that is the problem.
And I have a question on the sheet that came through. Which wines are most susceptible to smoke effects? Low pH or high pH, high anthocyanin or low anthocyanin?
Any of the winemakers want to give their perspective, or Carolyn, if she's still on?
It matters much on the anthocyanin level. If you're talking about the grapes, we have in California this year that all of our results on the Pinot Noir is coming back higher, and the results on the Chardonnays are coming back lower from the same vineyard. So that's just sort of something that Elizabeth also mentioned, that she heard from the Australians. We don't have research on that at all. Of course, it's just more some observations that people have been seeing, maybe due to the thickness of the skin more than anything else. But then when you bring the wines into the cellar, it does seem like like we've been talking about, if you're in a highly impacted area, the lighter style wines are going to show that impact more than a bigger style wine.
So to build on that, I think a friend in California, and Alisa, you can tell me if it's true, is that some people are more heavily acidifying their test ferments, just to try to force that hydrolysis of the bond. Have you heard of people doing that?
So I can let you guys know that the adjustment you would do in your ferments is not really enough to force that. When we run the analysis for this, which it is going to be an option OSU is going to offer, acid hydrolysis, we have to drop the pH to between 1.5 and 2 to release those compounds. So the sort of, you might be able to get a little bit if you do a little acid adjustment, but it's highly unlikely you're going to be able to do enough to release a lot of it.
Okay.
Right, exactly, Elizabeth. I think that, I mean, I would agree with those observations. I think when you look at labs that do the acid hydrolysis to try to push the bound compounds out, yeah, I believe it's down to 1 pH or 1.5, Elizabeth?
Yeah, it's right up there with battery acid.
Right, exactly, which isn't really natural in your wine, of course. So you're sometimes pushing out compounds that wouldn't normally come out in your wine, kind of creating some possible false positives.
So is that a time versus acid or hydrogen content over time? Meaning if you have a pH of 3 versus a pH of 4, would you expect that the pH of 3 would release compounds over a shorter period of months than would a 9?
Theoretically, yes. I don't know how much more, but it would have the potential to do it sooner. It could be a couple days versus a month. We don't know at this point in time.
And the only other thing that I would add is that's been banging around in my brain is that with lower pHs in fermentation, you do get the anthocyanin in a form that's more readily able to polymerize. And so you do generally with lower pH fermentations make darker wines. And so to the idea, Lisa's point, perhaps that's, paying attention to pH is something that you could think about. Not necessarily recommending it, but something that I've been thinking about.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, it's worth trying. I think this is it's a learning year.
I have one more question that comes from the gorge. It was saying that smoke taint was worse in the gorge after the rains during the Eagle Creek fire. Any thoughts on rain on smoke affected fruit? And also, is there a dilution influence if you have rain and then continue to allow your fruit to ripen? Is there any dilution of the smoke compounds?
I have no idea. Anyone have any thoughts?
I'm not sure the question exactly, but I mean, compounds don't go away. Once they're in the skins, right, Elizabeth? Once they're in the skins, they're there. So
yeah. So rain would not necessarily wash anything, but potentially ash on. They've been absorbed. They're in the grapes. They're not going anywhere until you start opening the grapes up.
And if the compounds got higher, it's because as you get riper, we do tend to see this in microferments too. As you get as you get riper, the cells seem to break down more, which will give up more of the smoke compounds.
Great. Well, if there's no more questions coming through, Elizabeth, is there any final thoughts from OSU or the OWRI team before we wrap this up?
I did just want to say we are trying to open up testing for people, and that is directly from a lot of comments and asks from industry. We're also trying for in the future to bring in some more capabilities. So should this happen, we would be able to process more samples, including bound compounds as well. And just to know that, I know it doesn't necessarily help this year, but you have a team of people at OSU and OWRI, as well as other universities that are trying to develop tools that can help with this problem should it happen again. And I did want to say thank you to everyone on the panel. It was so great to have such a range of individuals and to hear their thoughts.
Elizabeth?
Yeah.
This is George Harris. As crop insurance agent, there's a couple of points that I want to bring out that those people that do have crop insurance, one, make sure that you've contacted your agent. Two, in the sampling process, work with the adjuster on determining how those samples should be taken. And then number three, if you choose not to harvest, there is an assessment that they have that they deduct from the claim, which is a harvest cost amount. That's varies between state and counties, but typically here in the Willamette Valley and even in Southern Oregon, that's $160 per ton. And they figure the way the policy was set up is that the cost of harvest is built into the value of the grapes. And since you do not have that expense of harvest, then they deduct that out of the claim. So that is something to be aware of in making your decision on whether or not you are going to harvest in respects to crop insurance.
Thanks for that information, George. And thank you to all of the speakers and panelists, and especially to Elizabeth Tomasino, who assisted in all of the interviews and helping me with all of the interviews in the Southern Hemisphere and beyond. If there are any additional questions, please continue to send them through. We will be releasing this recording to you most likely tomorrow afternoon. And we will also try to release a recap of the Q&A questions that came through also. So until then, if everyone can just please send through questions, keep checking the toolkit for more information. Thank you all for being here and for all your great questions. Stay safe out there, and good luck, everyone.